Hello, everyone. We are gathering this evening. Please feel free to share in the chat where you are joining us from. We always love to hear where everyone is here from. So let's see if we start getting some comments in. We'll let everyone funnel in for just a moment before we get started. Oh, yeah, Chestertown, Maryland, first one in. Oh, Durham, North Carolina. Local and close to my heart. Ooh, Sydney, Australia. Look at that. Wonder what time it is there. Greenville, South Carolina. Greensboro, North Carolina. Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Arlington, Virginia. Jacksonville, Florida. All right. Quite a group already. So please keep sending those in and we'll get started. Hello, my name is David Palco and I am one of the co-directors of Jane Austen and Company and the Jane Austen Summer Program. I am joined here tonight by my fellow co-hosts, Susan Allen Ford and Heather King. Our technical director for this series is Nadea Pugh. We are all tied by a love of Austen, British literary and material history, and in this series, the Brontë sisters. We are excited tonight to continue our spring series, Austen and the Brontes. And at the outset of this evening's program, we would like to thank the North Carolina Humanities Council for their generous support, which has in part made this program possible. North Carolina Humanities is a statewide nonprofit and the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. North Carolina Humanities connects North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. So we are very grateful for their funding, which has played a significant role in making this series a reality.
Hello, my name is Heather King, and I'm excited to be taking my first turn as a co-host for this event. I'm glad to be here with everyone. If you have not been able to join us for other events in the series, remember that you can always stream them on our website, www.janeaustenandco.org. I have found these wonderful resources for teaching. They're great to assign your students for a little classroom flipping. In our most recent event in the series, we heard from Professor Talia Schaefer about communities of care in the works of Jane Austen and Charlotte Brontë. The recording of her fascinating talk, When Nobody Cares, Jane Eyre, Anne Elliot, and the Problem of Community, is posted on our website and is available to view at any time you wish. So please check it out if you weren't able to attend.
Tonight's event will be a moderated discussion rather than a presentation, so we'll be following a slightly different format than usual. Nadea will explain how to post comments and questions, which will be especially important tonight, and then Susan will introduce our speaker, and then after that, we'll get started.
Thank you so much, David. Hi, everybody. Welcome to YouTube, our streaming platform. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, please use the comment feature on the sidebar. Unlike most of our recent events, tonight's event is a moderated discussion, so we'll be asking and answering questions throughout the event instead of only at the end. So please feel free to post comments and questions at any point, and please, please, please get them in because we and our speakers love to hear from you. To post in that sidebar, you will need to log into your Google or YouTube account, but if you don't have a YouTube or Google account, that's okay as well. You can just submit your questions to info@janeaustenandco.org. We'll collect questions there as well and ask those for you. We look forward to hearing your thoughts.
So tonight we continue our Austen and the Brontes series by speaking with Laura Rocklyn. Laura is an actress, writer, and first-person historical interpreter. She's performed with regional theater companies across the country, and she writes and performs historic character portrayals for educational groups and museums, including the Smithsonian and Colonial Williamsburg. Laura's credits include an original adaptation of Jane Eyre, co-authored with Sally Boyett, which was performed at the Classic Theater of Maryland. Her one-woman play, Charlotte Brontë, To Do More and Better Things, was presented as part of the North American Friends of Chawton House 2021 Speaker Subscription Series. Laura has published articles in Brontë Studies and the Revere Express, the blog of the Paul Revere House, And she was the winner of the LitMag 2021 Virginia Woolf Award for short fiction. Laura holds an MFA in creative writing from Emerson College and an MFA from the Shakespeare Theater Company's Academy for Classical Acting at the George Washington University. She also received a Shakespeare certificate from the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. Tonight, we're going to see clips from her performances as Jane Austen and as Charlotte Brontë, and we'll get a chance to discuss the clips with her. So get your questions ready. So to start, welcome, Laura. Thank you for joining us. And would you tell us a little bit about how you got into performing Charlotte Brontë and Jane Austen?
Well, I think, growing up, I always loved history. And I think I got into theater because it was a way to bring these historical stories that I loved to life. And, when I was younger, I read a lot of Anne of Green Gables and Little Women and books about young women who were acting and were writing and had interests in studying these things as well, which was really marvelous. And I was fortunate in having a mother who supported these interests. And so when I was quite young, we started traveling over to England, and she would always take me to the houses of the authors whose books I was reading at the time. So when I was quite young, I visited Jane Austen's house, and I remember for some reason, the most important thing to me on that trip was the beautiful tree in the garden. I thought it was perfect for Mr. Collins to peek around when I was about 10 or 11. I was very excited about that. And I'll never forget the first time also I walked in to the graveyard that surrounds the Haworth Parsonage Museum where the Brontes lived. And just felt it's an incredible atmosphere between this very overcrowded, heavy graveyard. And then you just walk to the gate behind the house and there's the expanse of the moors. And that contrast of emotion just in the landscape was really exciting. Mm-hmm. And, it's funny that when I went to college, I did a double major in English literature and theater and thought, how am I going to practically combine these interests when I come out? And that's always the question. But I did discover historical interpretation through an internship at Colonial Williamsburg. And so when I came out of school, I continued to study Charlotte Brontë and Jane Austen. And when someone said to me one day, would you like to do a performance for our library as an author? I said, yes, Jane Austen, and set to work right away. And a few years thereafter, I had an opportunity to start developing a play on Charlotte. But it's been a real joy because their novels are so well known and so loved. But the stories behind them about the historical women are equally fascinating in many ways. So it's been a great joy to get to share those as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Heather or David, do you have something else you'd like to ask Laura?
I do actually have a question because honestly, Laura, I think you might have my dream job to be able to combine theater and English literature in the way that you do. So I was very curious from an acting perspective, what is different for you about doing historical interpretation versus other acting challenges or opportunities that you might have? Is there a different sort of preparation or different concerns you're thinking about as you're doing it?
I mean, I think the biggest difference is that it's sort of complete immersion when you're doing historical interpretation, because you do have a scripted component, but then most often there is a Q&A afterwards, both in character as the person and out of character as Laura. So while, if I have a playlist for a play I'm doing, I recently performed my adaptation of Jane Eyre. It had music from all different time periods that I just thought spoke to that story. But if it's a day when I'm portraying Charlotte Brontë, I'm only listening to music from that period, hopefully pieces that she's mentioned in her letters, I know she listened to and loved. And it's much more, I think, fully immersive in the time period as well as in the emotions. And there's also this sort of frightening responsibility, because I think everybody out there who reads, especially Jane Austen's novels, has a version of Jane in their head that they live with and they love and is their best friend. Mm-hmm. And so to come in front of people and say to them, I am, portraying Jane Austen for you, is a grave responsibility. And that's why my research relies so heavily on the letters of the person themselves, because they express themselves better than anyone can ever talk about their lives for them. So it's a joy to have this excuse, I think, to go back and look deeply at the letters and see how they were responding to the events in the world around them. And the lovely thing portraying a number of women now who live in the same era is that I'm able to put together the stories of what's happening in the world in different places in really wonderful ways, which is quite exciting.
Thank you, Laura. I am very excited to hear more about this because this is so fascinating. I agree with Heather. It is a dream job. One of the things I think might be helpful for those in the audience is to talk a little bit more about your career trajectory, kind of what are the productions you've been involved in and kind of the order that you approach those, because I think that might help set the stage for us talking about the productions in more detail.
Sure. Well, I was very lucky because at the end of college, I started auditioning. But I also thought being an actor is not a very safe profession. So I also started applying to grad schools. And it kind of came down to what's going to happen first. And I got a job offer to go on tour with the national players out of Olney Theater Center, playing Lucy in Dracula and Bianca in Taming of the Shrew. And I went to
saw that.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, how fabulous.
Fangirl here. Oh, I didn't realize it was you, though. But go ahead.
But I went to the advisor. I'd been accepted into grad school by then, and I said to him, "I'm torn. I want to come back to grad school and do this, but here's the job offer I got." And he said, "Do it." He said, "Grad school will always be here, but those roles may not come around again." So I did go on tour with players, which was great. I worked with them for over a year, actually, which was so much fun. And then that brought me as an actor to Washington, D.C., where there is a very vibrant community, especially doing Shakespeare. But one of the other joys of D.C. is that there's so much history that as a day job, I was working at Mount Vernon as a first-person historical interpreter playing Eliza Custis. So at night, I was performing. During the day, I was doing research and bringing this historical character to life. And, looking for a balance in doing both of those things, both of which I really loved. And eventually it came to a point where I was, as many actors are, I was getting callbacks for the equity theaters and almost getting there and not getting hired. So I went back to grad school for theater to bump that up a little bit. And it worked, which was marvelous. And I got to perform in a lot of Austen adaptations, which has been a real joy. Going through the ranks from Lydia Bennet to Marianne Dashwood to Eleanor Dashwood to Lizzie Bennet, which has all been great fun. And then I hit an age where people weren't quite sure what to do with me because I'm not necessarily an ingenue anymore, but I'm also quite short. And so I thought I'm going to start writing more of the stories I want to tell about historical women who shockingly did have stories to tell when they were my age. And so that's the point at which I went back and did a creative writing master's degree. And coming out of that, I've now more actively combined those two masters into creating a job that focuses on the first person interpretation, even though there are clearly shows that come along, like the recent Jane Eyre adaptation, I'm not going to turn down.
Thank you.
This is an interesting, two questions really before we get into the clips. One, Wendy wants to know if the figurines on your shelf are Charlotte and Jane.
I couldn't resist. So this one is Jane Eyre, and this one is Anne Elliot. So yes, I figured they were the appropriate ones to have behind me today.
Okay, thank you.
It's important to dress the set.
Well, exactly. Yes.
Well, it's a perfect follow-up to Talia's talk. The same characters. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah. And then here's a question from Kira. How do you answer questions that Jane would have known the answer to, but we don't? Like, what's the name of your cat? Or how do you feel about your brother George? And I mean, those are interesting questions that probably wouldn't come up later. So I thought we'd do them now.
No, they are. And that's a very good question. It's always the trick of answering questions in character, is that you want to be entirely truthful, but you also want to sort of maintain this illusion, especially with younger audiences. So for something like that, one good thing is both Austen and Charlotte Brontë were not terribly outgoing individuals. So it's if there's something that's difficult to answer, with George, I can talk a little bit about what happened to him and why he wasn't able to stay with our family and where he was sent. If it's something like the name of the cat that I don't know, I can always say, something like some secrets are best left undisturbed. There's always a way to to get around it. And certainly Charlotte Brontë is much easier in that than Jane Austen because, we have a finite number of Jane Austen's letters, whereas we have so many of Charlotte's because thankfully Ellen Nussey did not follow Charlotte's husband's advice and burn her letters. And we also have some of Charlotte's diary papers. So the wonderful thing with the Roe Head journals is that she's revealing things she might not have put in a letter to somebody else. So I feel like for her, I have access to more of her private thoughts, which is a real luxury. Although I also try not to share things that she wouldn't want shared. I mean, they are available on the British Public Library website. Anyone can read them. But I try to be decorous in what she as a person would say talking with other people and what she wouldn't.
And I suppose as yourself, you can always refer people to the British Library website.
Exactly. And often, I'll say, someone will ask me a question and I'll say it's difficult for me to answer that in the year 1815 or whatever the year may be. And then when I step out of character to answer questions, I'll say, going back to that question, here's what scholars now think. Here are some articles you can read. We don't exactly know. So that's the helpful thing about doing both in and out of character questions.
Yeah.
Because one of the really important things, especially with women who lived in such a fraught time period, is being able to contextualize everything I'm saying intelligently in a way that's helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Those comments actually sparked my curiosity about something. The sense I've gotten is that both Charlotte Brontë and Jane Austen are authors that you love, and so you were drawn to represent them because of your affection for them. You've expanded and you have several American historical female figures that you're working on now. Now that you've been doing this a couple of times, to what extent does the existing archive shape the likelihood that you will tackle a figure or not? Are you spoiled by Brontë now and you want to work on people who have more than 156 letters available, and how do you balance the diary and the letters? But yeah, how much does archive accessibility existence shape your practice?
No, that's a marvelous question. And it does a lot in the women that I personally choose to portray. Recently, I've been asked to do some women who have smaller archives, but because they're commissions, I still dive into it and find what I can. But one of my other favorite women I portray, who I actually, or portray, not betray. Oh dear, that's not a good one. But I portray is Louisa Catherine Adams, who was actually born in the same year as Jane Austen, not very far from her. But the wonderful thing about Louisa is that all of her diaries, papers, plays, poetry is on microfilm a few blocks from me here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So Louisa is someone wonderful to work on because anytime that a question comes up I don't know the answer to, I can go right to the source. And that really is a wonderful, wonderful thing. I mean, also her husband, John Quincy Adams, kept such insanely meticulous diaries. They're absolutely marvelous. You know where they were and what they were doing every day. And it does make a big difference because then you do feel armed to answer any question, which is quite lovely.
Well, why don't we get into the clips, but before we do that, could you just describe the story arc or the overview of each of the two plays for us so we know where these clips are coming in?
Absolutely. So one thing I do when I'm approaching a historical figure is I want the plays to be plays and to be active and have an emotional arc and not just be me sitting there sharing dates for 45 minutes. So with Jane Austen, that catalyst is in this particular play, she has just returned from visiting the Prince Regent's London house with the Reverend Mr. Clark. And it's a moment of her thinking, how did I get here? And sort of realizing that the writing of her novels has now gotten her to this, point of, celebrity almost, even though her name is not widely known yet. And from the point of coming home, she sort of thinks, what happened? And this prompts her to look back over her life. And it ends with her sort of settled happily at Chawton, working on the Elliots, which will, later be published as Persuasion. For the Charlotte Brontë play, I went back and forth on where I wanted it to start. There are so many intensely emotional moments in her life. It was hard to narrow down. But I very much wanted it to end at a point when she was also at the height of her literary celebrity. So the play starts with her receiving a letter from the mother of her publisher, George Smith, telling her that George has become engaged. And notoriously, her answer to this letter was very cryptic. She wrote back, "In great happiness as in great grief, words of sympathy should be few. Accept my meed of congratulation, and believe me sincerely yours, Charlotte Brontë." Now, I think if a woman who was so good with language wrote that curt and short a letter, there's a reason. So for that play, it's her receiving this news about George that she was not necessarily expecting, and sort of thinking about how is she going to respond to this is what sends her back. But the clip that we're going to see is actually from right after she, Emily, and Anne have sent out their first 3 novels. Emily's Wuthering Heights, Anne's Agnes Grey, and Charlotte's The Professor for publication. And what we'll see in the clip is that Emily and Anne's novels get accepted for publication. They don't get published right away, but that's a separate issue. But Charlotte's The Professor is still looking for a home. And so another very dramatic event prompts Charlotte to start writing Jane Eyre, and that's where this clip comes in.
Okay, well, thank you. So I think we should be able to tell which time we're looking at Jane Austen and which time we're looking at Charlotte Brontë. So
I do hope so.
Okay, Nadea, could you play those first 2 clips for us, please?
I am all amazement. I, Jane Austen, the daughter of an obscure country parson, have just returned from a visit to Chawton House, the Prince Regent's London residence. Although house seems a somewhat inappropriate title for a place that has been quite aptly described as not inferior to the French Palace of Versailles. I must admit to feeling somewhat overwhelmed by such a display of grandeur, growing up as I did in the unostentatious surroundings of a quiet Hampshire village. Well, I was never so surprised in my life as I was to discover one morning that no less important personage than the Prince Regent's librarian, the Reverend Mr. Clark, had arrived at my brother Henry's home in London to call upon me, and at the instigation of the Regent, no less. Imagine my astonishment when this formidable personage imparted his even more formidable message that His Royal Highness is such a great admirer of your little books, and particularly of Pride and Prejudice, that he wishes to extend to you an invitation to visit his official residence. Well, the visit to the place itself was most interesting. Well, among the many flattering attentions which I received from the Reverend Mr. Clark was the information of my being at liberty to dedicate my future work to His Royal Highness without the necessity of any further solicitation on my part. Therefore, as my Emma is now nearing the time of her publication, she shall have the honor of being embellished with the name of the Regent, and my publisher, Mr. Murray, shall send an advanced copy to Mr. Clark to grace the library shelves at Chawton House. While our books were on their journey, I embarked on one of my own, accompanying my father to Manchester so that an operator could remove the cataracts that had almost completely robbed Papa of his sight. After the harrowing operation, Papa was to be confined in bed for 4 days. He was to speak and be spoken to as little as possible. As I spent these silent days tending to my sightless father, I began work on a new novel about a young governess named Jane Eyre. Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey were accepted for publication by a Mr. Newby, at terms somewhat impoverishing to the 2 authors. The Professor found acceptance nowhere. With heaviness of spirit, I realized that I would be 31 next birthday. My youth was gone like a dream, and very little use I had made of it. I tried one publishing house more, Mr. Smith and Elder, I received a letter which I opened in the dreary expectation of finding that Mr. Smith and Elder were disinclined to publish the manuscript. Instead, I found a letter of 2 pages. Well, it declined indeed to publish that tale, but added that a work in 3 volumes would meet with careful consideration. So, with trembling hands, I sent the manuscript of my recently completed Jane Eyre to Mr. Smith and Elder, and she was accepted for publication and appeared in print on the 16th of October in 1847. It is always strange to have to watch oneself. Yeah.
It must be, especially as 2 different people. That's even, I would think, weirder. And we certainly can see who is who. I mean, that I think is really remarkable and wonderful. So I guess maybe to start with, talk a little bit about your choice of, these 2 moments in the biography. I mean, here is Jane, a published author, being sought out by the Prince Regent, and here is Charlotte writing her 2nd novel, but not published yet. And why these 2 moments? I think they're very interesting.
I think it's an interesting thing about the 2 of them, in that so much of what one reads in Charlotte's letters and diaries is self-doubt and sort of this constant questioning. And I think, one of the things I find so fascinating about her is she has this brilliant mind. She expresses herself so beautifully, but so much of what she expresses is questioning if what she's doing is good enough. And I think there was something about this moment when her very strong and powerful father is completely incapacitated. I mean, the idea of undergoing a cataract surgery with no anesthetic, and then having to lie still and quiet in a dark room for several days, and that Charlotte is looking after him and starting to write Jane Eyre. I've always found it fascinating that it implies to me that she must have known how the novel was going to end at the outset, because she's tending to a blind man as she is starting to write this novel. And I find that really intriguing. With Jane Austen, on the other hand, and I'm sure a little bit of it is a veneer, because again, as I said, entirely what we have from her is letters, where she knows someone is listening to her tone of voice. But I feel like there's often this sort of a flippant delight, slightly snarky in what is going on around her, and this wonderful observant quality. And I think the way that she copes with and deals with the Reverend Mr. Clark is very much part of that. I mean, it's hilarious to read their letters back and forth. I was looking at them again this afternoon, where he's clearly fangirling over her, for lack of a better word, but also telling her that she really ought to write a novel about a clergyman just like him, because he thinks it would be so fascinating and sells so well. And it's an intriguing look at the author's 2 very different worlds, where at this point in her life, at least, and it will change, but Charlotte's sort of in this vacuum, writing literally shut away in a dark room. And Jane is sort of having these random people connected to the Prince Regent tell her what they think she ought to be writing. And I must say, even though she met him later, his voice still sounds very much like Mr. Collins.
Yeah. And I love the way that you get at her snarky playfulness that comes across in the letter to him in a different way in performance. I mean, it's because it seems like you're so deep into her perspective in the letters that you can just take that and transform it in your writing and your acting.
Well, it's a lovely thing about, I've been doing research on Austen. My first paper on her was when I was 13, I think. And so it has been such a long time that, for a while, the language, it helps. to have been immersed in it for such a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And with Charlotte as well, because I did my undergraduate thesis on spirituality in Charlotte Bronte's novels. I spent so much time just simply surrounded by her novels and letters and very little else except for a cup of tea, that it makes a big difference in being able to transpose them, hopefully, to something that sounds accurate on the stage.
Do you find yourself pulling language from the novels to supplement what you have from the letters? Or if you're trying to figure out how to articulate something from the letters, are the novels helpful to give you additional verbiage to play with?
You know, oddly, I don't know why I've not done that with Jane Austen as much, unless it's inadvertent. But I have with Charlotte Brontë. The ending quote of the play is actually one of the last lines from Villette. And it was because I was struggling to put a button on it because, you know, she is always so articulate and so thoughtful. And it feels that this is an emotional moment for her when she would put some powerful button. And so I did take the quote from Villette about liberty lending us her wings and hope guiding us by her star. Because there was nothing really in her letters, because she didn't expect to go when she did, that felt like a button on the story.
Laura, one of the details that I thought was interesting when we juxtaposed these two clips was the way that both Jane and Charlotte talk about their characters. It's, you know, as if they're these kind of embodied people. My Emma is about to be published, my Jane. And I'm curious how your research into these authors and their voices and their relationships to their characters might have influenced some of that language.
Well, we have that lovely letter from Austen where she refers to Pride and Prejudice as her own darling child. And I think that spoke to me a great deal, especially because she never married and never had children. I love this idea that, you know, her books are her children. And I think there is another quote, although I can't remember which letter it's from, that she says, "My books are my children. They provide me with sufficient interest for happiness." And I've always thought that was lovely, that all you need for happiness is interest. And also the way she talks about Lizzie Bennet being as delightful a character as ever was seen in print. There's the wonderful letter where Jane gets so excited when she goes to the Spring Gardens exhibit in London, I think with Henry, and finds a portrait she thinks looks just like Miss Bingley, and says that she looked for portraits of Elizabeth and Jane Bennet as well. So I feel like, you know, the characters are very much alive to her. And with Charlotte, it's a little different. It's interesting because you probably are aware she has this incredible output of juvenilia. She and her brother Branwell created this fantasy world called Angria. If you've not read the juvenilia, it's fabulous. It's just as crazy and chaotic and captivating as Game of Thrones. But she talks about those characters in her Rowhead journal very much as if they're alive. She'll literally, you know, say that she is sitting in her room writing and the Duke of Zamorna walks in and she has to write the scene because it's happening in front of her. And she doesn't do that as much with the characters in her novels later. But I think that might have been because a lot of the novels were working through some very painful memories. And so perhaps at that point when it was no longer this lovely fantasy and it had become very real, it was harder for her to do.
Very interesting. We have a question from Alice that I think is a fascinating one. She says, rejection is hard, but sometimes anticipating success is scary. How did these two authors deal with their different levels of success or fame?
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting because sort of something similar happened, but in very different ways, in that they both were comparatively quietly living in the country. Their first novels got published, were successful, and suddenly they were catapulted into literary London. But the interesting thing is that for Jane, it meant being able to go up and stay with Brother Henry, and, you know, be in a world in which she was quite comfortable. And, you know, Henry's working as her agent with her publishers, and she also was publishing anonymously, you know, by a lady. And I think she was able to take it in increments, perhaps a bit more than Charlotte was, because, you know, with Charlotte Brontë, she, Emily, and Anne had published their first novels. Anne published her second. And then there was this crisis because all of a sudden Charlotte's publisher in England, his North American partner, wrote to him and said, "How dare you? Someone else here has published the new Charlotte Brontë novel before I did." And so Charlotte, Emily, and Anne realized that they had to stop trying to keep up their anonymity, because they were all publishing under pseudonyms at that time, which meant that there was a lot of speculation that there weren't three of them. There was just one of them writing all of these novels and publishing them, and that one of them was probably a man. Typical. So Charlotte and Anne, had to travel down to London and prove to their publisher that they were two separate people and that they were women. Emily was still alive at the time, but refused to go to London because she had no interest in celebrity fame or leaving Haworth, period. But so Charlotte and Anne sort of got thrown into this overnight, not by choice. Their trip down had been harrowing and exhausting. They arrived feeling awful, looking awful, and their lovely, charming young publisher immediately wanted to take them to the opera and to meet his mother and his sisters and to do all of these things. And they basically get home to Haworth and say it was so exciting, but they're both shattered. So I think for them, it was a little bit of a baptism of fire getting thrown in the deep end. And of course, very shortly after the novels are published, the big three, Wuthering Heights, Agnes Grey, and Jane Eyre, all come out in 1847. Emily dies in 1848, Anne dies in 1849. So Charlotte, I think, as you say, this expectation, there had always been this expectation that the three of them would become famous together and would cope with this together and would keep writing together. And then all of a sudden, Charlotte finds that she's alone. And it's sort of heartbreaking because she was in the middle of writing her second novel, Shirley, when Anne and Emily died. She stopped when Emily died and doesn't pick it up until after Anne's death. And the chapter she started writing after Anne died is called The Valley of the Shadow. And you can really tell that she's suddenly alone in the house and she misses her sisters desperately. So I think that had a big influence on the way that she was able to cope.
Yeah, that's a great answer to that question. I mean, that really, I think, brings home to us the emotional journey that you have to go on as you're putting these plays together and performing them. You know, it's not a simple story that's just about plot. You know, it's really inhabiting someone else's self in a way.
And actually, Susan, that's a perfect segue into the question that I wanted to ask Laura. I'm hung up on thinking about this from an actor's perspective, so forgive me. But I was wondering, from your perspective as an actor, what goes into performing these very different characters and how you sort of inhabit them or embody them differently. It's clear that you've done work on distinguishing their accents. I'd love to hear about that, and how what we saw were video productions of them, but you've performed them in 3D, so to speak, as well. And so how you use the space that's available to you when you're staging them as well. So what goes into the performance of them?
Absolutely. And it is very immersive, and it's lovely because they are such very different women living honestly in very different times and places. I mean, Austen dies in 1817 and Charlotte's born in 1815, so they overlap a little bit. But really, Regency England and Victorian England are wildly different worlds. And certainly, where Jane is living in the South is very different to where Charlotte's living in the North. And the dialect is a way into that. And honestly, the dialects I do are not necessarily exactly what we think they would have had. It's funny with Charlotte Brontë, the one reference we have to the way she sounded is when she first arrived at Roe Head School, which was the second boarding school she went to after the infamous Cowan Bridge on which Lowood is based. But when she arrives at Roe Head, her friend Mary Taylor wrote that she was a funny little thing with a queer Irish accent. And it's interesting to think, her father, Patrick, was Irish. if he's primarily educating the children up until the point they go to Roe Head, and they are in quite an isolated place, it makes sense that the children at that age might have had a bit of an Irish dialect. But that said, she would then have been in Roe Head for a while. I'm sure most people around her had Yorkshire dialects. And I attended a talk actually during COVID on adapting her novels that included, I think, Sally Wainwright and, other people who have done adaptations and are Brontë scholars. And they all said that they were quite sure that the sisters should have Yorkshire dialects. So I do like a twinge of Yorkshire with her. It's mainly on the vowels. So thinking that at boarding school, being trained to be a governess, they may have tried to give her something more closely resembling RP, but she still has that home, especially, again, with the emotional arc, when she gets more upset. I try to get the Yorkshire dialect to be a bit heavier, thinking that she's going back to her childhood with that.
Yeah.
For Austen, in all likelihood, because in the Regency, regional dialects were so much more prevalent than they are now, it's very likely that she actually might have had a bit of a Hampshire dialect. But I have a feeling if I did that in a program about Austen, people would be very surprised and very confused. And one of the things of doing performances is that you also don't want your audience ear to be thrown off. So all they're doing is sitting there going, why is she talking like that? So I sort of made the executive decision to do a received pronunciation dialect as people hear in the films, about Austen and the adaptations of her novels. But if people ask me about it, I do always mention that it's likely that she would have had something more like a Hampshire dialect.
I have to confess, I don't know what a Hampshire dialect would sound like. I don't want to put you on the spot. So.
It's a bit more hard R's. If you've ever watched Lark Rise to Candleford, that's in sort of the Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire border. And so, actually, it sounds a bit Irish. But yeah, it's not as sort of rounded and graceful. Okay. But you watch Thomas Hardy adaptations as well. Sort of the rural Wessex is not too far from there.
Gotcha.
And it's a similar type of dialect.
Interesting.
Fascinating. I love that detail work.
Yeah.
So we have another question from Kira that I think is interesting that relates to your clip. So in the Emma dedication, Jane Austen repeats His Royal Highness so often that some have wondered if she is mocking the honor of dedicating it to the Prince Regent. What are your thoughts?
Yes, 150%. And actually, the clip that we played is a fairly early version of this program. And now in the program, she's slightly more snarky about His Royal Highness in that section. But I do 100% think that she essentially was given a royal command. She had to dedicate her novel to this man she did not like very much. One of his country seats was quite close to their home in Chawton or in Steventon. They heard all kinds of rumors, all sorts of horrible things. She was very much on the side of the Prince Regent's wife in that particular scandal. And I think, yes, when she was told that she had to make this dedication, she did it, but she did it with as much overly, unctuous pomposity as she possibly could.
Great word choice.
Going from Heather's question about, the ways you're inhabiting the characters and the accents and that sort of thing, do you want to talk a little bit about the costuming at this stage? And Nadea can put up the slides.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the lovely things about the costuming is that just the way you feel in the wardrobe of those two eras makes your physicality different. Because in Jane Austen, I'm wearing my little Regency short stays, also called jumps in the period, that only sort of go down halfway. They do not sort of go around your waist. There's nothing about them that is giving you a tiny waist, because your waist it's an empire one. It's right under your bust line. So it's, very free to move in, very easy. And then for Charlotte, I do have my full mid-19th century corset. And yes, here are lovely two of my research images. So the one on the left is what's known as Charlotte's Thackeray dress. Laura has a dress she wore to the dinner party where she met William Makepeace Thackeray. So not the clip you saw, but once in a while I have two Charlotte dresses I rotate. And I have a dress that I worked with Joanna at Blue Lady Couture to create that is a similar pattern and style to the Thackeray dress. Because one of the things I love doing in the program is debunking this popular vision that Charlotte Brontë was Jane Eyre and that she always wore black and was very decorous and dowdy. Because especially after she studied at the pensionnat in Brussels, and then after her books became successful and she had a little more money, she dressed quite elegantly. On the right is what's known as Charlotte's striped dress. And I got to see that in 2022. I was at the Brontë Parsonage Museum, and they had a wonderful exhibit curated by Dr. Eleanor Houghton, the fashion historian, called Defying Expectations Inside Charlotte Brontë's Wardrobe. And this was one of the dresses on display. So it's the one that the dress I was wearing in the clip we saw is based on, because it has those very fashionable sort of mid-century bell sleeves. And it's, this beautiful silk dress. So I love seeing extant articles of her clothing that show sort of what a wonderful color and fashion sense she had. I mean, I would honestly wear the Thackeray dress in life now, I think. But you can also see how much she did cinch her waist in. And one of the things about which she was wildly vain, if Charlotte was vain about anything, and there were not many things she had a very low self-esteem, I'm afraid, in terms of appearance, but she was very proud of her tiny hands and tiny feet. You can see the little pair of her shoes there by the striped dress, and they are quite small. Wow. She was only about 4'10", 4'11", so she was a very petite woman, and that's one thing of which she was quite proud. But I think we have a couple of Jane Austen images as well.
It's been a while since I've read Jane Eyre, but I do remember she spends a fair amount of time describing women's clothing and dressing and the textures of the fabrics, and so clearly she loved couture. So even if you want to think of her as Jane Eyre, I don't think it would have been dowdy necessarily.
I love that point, because it is from Jane's point of view and she's taking notice of all this. That's marvelous. Absolutely.
But she doesn't want to wear any of it herself. That's the problem.
Right. Too self-effacing.
And it does always make me giggle in Villette when Lucy Snowe, who's the heroine of that novel, if you've not read it, because I know it's not as popular, although it's wonderful, I recommend it. But there's one scene in which Lucy Snowe is given a pink dress. And the indignity of having to wear a pink dress to the opera is the subject of at least a chapter of the novel. It finally comes around to the pink dress, but it's after much soul searching and angst and much criticism from the novel's hero. So yes.
So is there, given what you were saying about the difference in corseting, and we can see that corset there for Jane Austen, do you have a sense of greater freedom in the Regency, body-wise, than you do in the Victorian period?
So it's interesting because there is a greater freedom to hinge at the waist, because you don't have the intense boning that you have in the Victorian era. For me personally, though, I'm odd, and I guess I spend enough time in period costumes that I actually really like, especially when I'm performing, having the support of a corset. Because I have something to breathe against, so I know how my breath control is doing. I also, if I get tired, I lean back and it holds me up. So there are things to be said for both. And I think, one thing about the bad reputation that corsets now have is that they are comfortable if they are very well fitted. And I have the great good fortune of having a dear friend who is a corset maker, Alexander Cheeseborough. You can find him on Instagram. He does some beautiful things. But so mine is fitted exactly to me. So I do find it very comfortable. But it is interesting, especially I talk about in the Jane Austen program, how even the change in styles has changed the way people are curtsying. Because when she was growing up and they still had the full skirts and the tight waists that we sort of associate with the colonial era, they were just curtsying by putting their heels together and essentially doing a ballet plie. But then once these sort of Regency Napoleonic era fashions came in that had tighter skirts, they couldn't always do that. And that's when it became stylish to put one leg behind the other to curtsy, because you could still do that in a very tight skirt, or comparatively tight skirt. It wouldn't be tight now, but for that period. But yeah, these were a couple of the costume pieces I looked at when I was last at Jane Austen's House Museum. And they're actually pieces that were made for the 1995 Pride and Prejudice that are now on display at the house, which is lovely to be able to take a look at them. And that one is a full-length Regency corset. As I said, mine is shorter, but they did also have the full-length ones. And this is coming into the era, in the 20s and 30s, so right after Jane Austen dies. But it's a very brief little epoch where women are actually designing corsets as well. And it's one of the reasons they think that they might have had a little more flexibility and give at the time, which of course changes again when you get back into the 40s and 50s and 60s.
I think we probably should move to the second set of clips. Nadea, we've got 4 clips now, 2 from Jane Austen and 2 from Charlotte Brontë. Can we have those and then we'll talk about them?
My debut at a ball at Enham House near Andover at the age of 17 in 1792. I fear I was as giddy and flirtatious as any other young lady dancing her way down the set. Indeed, there was one young man whose charms were such that I found it difficult not to give rise to gossip. Cassandra cautioned me frequently from afar. His name was Tom Lefroy, and he was a relation of our dear friend and my mentor, Mrs. Lefroy, who lived in the rectory at Ash and was our close neighbour at Steventon. Tom came to visit his aunt in the summer of 1796, and we soon gave cause for our names to be much coupled in gossip. Oh, imagine everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down and talking together. I was soon writing very flippant letters to Cassandra, who was staying with friends at some distance and was unable to be on hand as my chaperone. I recall writing to her that I looked forward with great impatience to the ball at Ash, as I expected to receive an offer from my friend in the course of the evening. I declared that I would refuse him, however, unless he promised to give away his white coat. It seems the older generation were not as sanguine about our relationship as Tom and I were, and he was sent away shortly after that ball that no further damage might be done to my affections or to his reputation. I suppose I must accept that the daughter of an obscure country parson is no match for a rising London barrister, and yet his departure was very difficult medicine to swallow. Well, in general, I do not want people to be very agreeable, as that saves me the trouble of liking them a great deal. And yet, I have in my life received one proposal of marriage. It was from Mr. Harris Bigwither, a neighbour of my brother Edward's in Kent. Cassandra and I were staying with their family over the Christmas holidays in 1802, and late one Thursday evening, December 2nd, Harris proposed. He was 21 at the time, and I 27. Well, at first, I accepted him. It would have been a very good thing for my mother and sister if I had married a man whose life is so useful, whose character and estate so estimable and worthy. And yet, in the dark watches of the night, I came to reconsider my willingness to give up my liberty without the requisite affection for my intended lord and master. And so the following morning, I had the unenviable task of resenting my acceptance of his kind proposal. I already knew that my books are my children. They provide me with sufficient interest for happiness, and to be honest, since my decision to refuse Mr. Bigwither, I have often triumphed over the married women of my acquaintance and rejoiced in my own freedom from care. Where a person wishes to attach, they should always be ignorant. To come with a well-informed mind is to come with an inability of administering to the vanity of others, which a sensible person would always wish to avoid. A woman especially, if she have the misfortune of knowing anything, should conceal it as well as she can. One comfort in those monotonous days of teaching at Roe Head was that my dear friend Ellen lived close enough at Brookroyd that I could visit her frequently. Communion with Ellen's calm and even mind was very soothing to my unsettled spirits. But there was one result of my frequent visits to Ellen's family that I did not expect. In March of 1839, Ellen's brother, the Reverend Henry Nussey, made me an offer of marriage. Well, there were in this proposal some things which might have proved a great temptation, but I asked myself 2 questions. Did I love Henry Nussey as much as a woman ought to love the man her husband? Would I be the best person to keep him happy? Alas, my conscience answered no to both these questions. I felt that I never could have that intense attachment to him, which would make me willing to die for him, and if I ever marry, it must be in that light of adoration that I shall regard my husband. Moreover, I was aware that Henry knew so little of me that he could hardly be aware to whom he was writing. I could not sit all day long making a grave face before my husband. I would laugh and satirize and say whatever came into my head first. But if he were a clever man and loved me, the whole world weighed in the balance would be as light as air. My loneliness and frustration came to a head one evening. I had been out for a long walk in the country that afternoon to clear my head, and returning to the city, I found myself opposite the Cathedral of Saint-Gudule. I took a fancy to make a real Catholic confession, just to see what it was like. I approached and knelt down in a niche that had just been vacated. I began by saying that I was a foreigner and had been brought up a Protestant. The priest responded that in that case I could not jouir du bonheur de la confesse. But I was determined to confess. At length, he said he would allow it because it might be the first step toward leading me back to the true church. Well, of course, the adventure stopped there. But shortly thereafter, I found my solitary position at the pensionnat had become insupportable. I went to Madame Heger and gave notice. Monsieur Heger declared with vehemence his decision that I should not go, but I had made my determination, and I was home the day after New Year's Day, 1844. As long as I live, I don't think I shall forget what it cost me to part with Monsieur Heger. It grieved me so much to grieve one who had been so kind and true and disinterested a friend.
It's interesting in that last clip where she's dealing with her feelings for Monsieur Leger. What you were saying earlier about your accent getting more intensified, I think we can hear. It's that emotion comes through in her voice.
Good, thank you. Yeah, that's a very hard section to play, but I love it because it is one of those ones that, a lot of that was drawn from a letter to Emily about the incident, but she does lift that out of her life and put it right in Villette. Lucy Snow has a similar breakdown. She finds herself in front of the cathedral, and much to her own personal horror, she goes in and makes a Catholic confession, even though she's a devout Protestant. And it's, precipitated by what Lucy at the time thinks is an unrequited love for one of her professors. And of course, for Charlotte, it was an unrequited attachment to a married professor of hers. But, that relationship did precipitate a lot of really incredible novels working through desperate affections for men who are unavailable. So turned it to good account. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's also wonderfully striking to hear set side by side the way they discussed marriage and what Austen was not willing to put up with in a way, and what they both were not willing to sacrifice for it. But then Bronte's line that she didn't love him enough to die for him, the sort of over the top, like I can't imagine Austen saying that about the marriage state.
Yeah, it really intrigues me because in some ways their responses are quite similar. and that they both sort of value their own integrity and independence of spirit too much at that point in their lives to get married. But as you say, then again, Jane goes off the sort of funny, flippant route where people wish to attach, they should always be ignorant. Whereas Charlotte goes to, I'm not willing to die for him, so I can't marry him. And it does, it shows that their writing styles were not put on. This is very much how they lived and felt as well. It's very truthful emotion in both cases. Although I do also love that Charlotte says she could not sit all day long making a grave face before her husband, because people think of her as being so solemn. But, you know, certainly the opening of Shirley with the curates, again, it's one not many people read, but I laughed out loud for most of that first chapter. So when she wants to be funny, she can.
So I think this builds off of the idea of emotion and interest, because we have another audience question that is a little different. But so, do you have a preference between playing Jane and Charlotte? And if so, how does that play out in your performance, knowing that Charlotte disliked Jane?
Oh, I have to tread so carefully because I don't want to be shunned when I go to Jane Austen Society AGMs. But yes, because people often answer, you know, I do the Charlotte Brontë play for Austen fan audiences quite frequently. And there's invariably the question about Charlotte Brontë not liking Jane Austen. And I think I would say I don't really have a preference for one over the other. I feel very differently about them. And I think it's one of the lovely things that doing the Jane Austen play is a pure joy. It's absolutely delightful from beginning to end. I have great fun with the audience. You know, there are a couple of moments of sort of emotional intensity, but overall, it's just a delight. The Charlotte Brontë one I love doing, but it takes a lot out of me because it is a lot of emotion. You know, there's a center section where Branwell dies and then Emily dies and then Anne dies, and so it's heavier to go into, but that's one of the things I love about her. I say I always, you know, go to her novels when I need my best friend to cry with. And so that's a really lovely thing. And I think too that, you know, she was introduced to Austen's novels after she'd written most of hers by her editor. And, you know, I think had Austen been an earlier influence, it's interesting how she might have shaped Bronte's work differently. Because growing up, you know, Charlotte's reading a lot of Shakespeare and Pope and Milton and Lord Byron and, you know, quite intense material. And so I think she probably had, you know, an idea in her head of what she wanted literature to be. But yeah, I love both of them. And I think, yeah, there are marvelous things in both cases. Honestly, I don't think Jane Austen would have liked Charlotte Bronte's novels very much. So it's probably mutual. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, one thing that I thought was neat in these four little scenes that we saw is that their ideas of love kind of conflicting with their possibility for independence and their writing come out, you know, in different language and with different kind of emotional charges, and yet they've got that in common.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how Jane sort of delights in this, you know, flirtation with Tom Lefroy, who it's quite clear from one of her early letters to Cassandra about him arriving, she says that she's enjoying flirting with him, but knows he's not staying very long. And there's a little of a feeling that I get that she's indulging in this flirtation because she knows it's safe. Whereas when Harris Bigwither actually proposes, that's an entirely different matter. Yeah. And similarly with Charlotte, when Henry Nussey proposes, she says that she's tempted, but that she's not the right woman for him. And she actually writes to him and tells him who the right woman would be. It's very funny. She describes his ideal wife. But then also, similarly with Charlotte, when she falls in love with Monsieur Léger, it's completely safe because he's married. So she can absolutely adore him, but there's no danger of him taking over. And it's interesting, when she finally marries Arthur Bell Nichols, at the end of her life, after her, you know, her three major novels are published, she has a letter to her friend Ellen Nussey that's a little bit chilling to me to read. There's the one where she says, Arthur's reading over my shoulder and says, you must burn my letters. They're dangerous as Lucifer matches. So he clearly doesn't want evidence out there of, it wasn't her sharing private things. But there's also one where she writes to Ellen and says she's not writing fiction anymore because Arthur wants to spend time with her and is jealous of any pursuit in which he cannot take a part. So, there's a reason that there was, and in some ways that's very sweet. And it sounds like she's thrilled that he wants to spend time with her and that's lovely for her. But from the outside looking at it, it always makes me shiver a little bit.
Yeah.
But yes.
Yeah. From outside looking at it, you want to say, get back to work.
We want more books, please.
Write some more.
Well, and 5 years later, how would she have felt about that?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, here comes a baby too. So that would have added in a whole another layer of complication.
Exactly.
You may never have written again anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Although some people managed it. So I guess she could have been one.
It's true. I mean, one of the other letters I love, it's an entirely different woman, but at the same time period. But I've always loved, there's a letter that Lydia Emerson, who was married to Ralph Waldo Emerson, writes, I think it's to Elizabeth Peabody. But I just love the description because she says, please forgive my bad handwriting. Waldo is working in his study and I have a baby in my other arm pulling on my hair. And I just love this image of the literary woman sitting there trying to write with the baby on her arm while her husband's in his study, thinking very seriously and writing very great things.
Yeah.
But I've always loved that line.
Yeah. Well, and in Jane Austen's letters, there's that thing she writes about Jane West, who says she's taking over some of the housekeeping. Jane Austen is while Cassandra's away, and she said, I don't know how Mrs. West wrote all those novels. My head is too full of doses of rhubarb and joints of beef or something like that. And I can't focus on composition, except she said it more elegantly than I just did. But, there's a kind of realization, even at the low level she's at, that household cares really are getting in the way.
Yeah, I always think that those of us who love her novels owe a great debt to Cassandra and to Martha Lloyd for taking the household work primarily off her hands.
Mm-hmm.
Because had they not been there and done that, as you say, she might not have had time. She might have been thinking about pies and puddings and
We don't have too much more time left, but I wanted to ask one question that we've got here from Paul. Do you have to begin your performances with an explanation of the historical setting to inform your audience of what you're depicting as we kind of did today? Or how do you get us in?
So with the performances themselves, I sort of begin in media res. I just come in and go. There is much more time though, because the scripted part of each performance lasts about 45 minutes. So I'm able, after sort of there's the initial, as I said, emotional moment that kicks off the story. But then I do go back and set the scene and I explain where we are, who my parents are, what I'm doing. And I do go through the lives in great detail, starting with education, going through the rejected marriage proposals, writing, and then becoming published authors. But if there's any confusion, that's one of the lovely things about having a Q&A at the end. Is people can ask for clarification. And I also love that because as we were discussing earlier, it allows us to bring in some of the questions about the wider world too, and other things going on in that era, which is really lovely.
All right. I think if Nadea, you would cue up the last two, and then we can talk about these, and then any other questions that are left over. These are two clips that Laura has provided of the landscape around these two places where our authors lived. Robin Adair. So do you want to say something about the differences between these two worlds and the two writers?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it, as I mentioned a bit earlier as well, the landscapes around them are so very different. And I think it inspires the moods of their novels a lot. I mean, one of the things that Charlotte Brontë notoriously said about Jane Austen is that her novels were well-cultivated gardens. And I do find it interesting that, Jane Austen's house museum is in the middle of this lovely, very well-cultivated garden. Up the street, at Chawton House where her brother lived, it's more open fields, but it's still all very nicely manicured and looked after. And it's a beautiful setting and very inspiring in its own way. But it also feels quite cozy and quite safe when you visit. There's a lovely sort of homey feeling. Whereas when you go up to Haworth, where the Brontë sisters lived, as I mentioned earlier, the parsonage where they lived is essentially the graveyard of the church is encroaching on the parsonage garden, which is beautiful. I love the garden. It was a beautiful place to sit. But you're constantly surrounded by gravestones. There was a huge issue with health in Haworth, so it was very overfull. And then you go down this little pathway, and I love it because the graveyard wall at one place is sort of tumbled over exactly the way it's described in Wuthering Heights by Kathy's grave, that the moor is taking back the graveyard. And I was kind of stunned that was just sitting there, maybe on purpose, but it looks very natural. And then it just opens up into this wild expanse. And I did the full walk out to Top Withens, which is a place that may or may not have been an inspiration for Wuthering Heights. And it takes a couple hours to walk out there, and you are still on this completely open moorland. And so it's a very different feeling of inspiration, but also exposure and peril. And that last little clip was of what's now called the Brontë Waterfall, which the Brontë children actually called the Meeting of the Waters, which is one of their favorite places to go and sit. And I included that because, she does talk in Jane Eyre about the rippling water when Jane is hearing Rochester's voice at the end, as well as the wind. And so sitting in that spot and hearing the different natural sounds, it creates a music, but you could also imagine hearing almost anything in those sounds out on the moors when you've been by yourself for a couple of hours walking. So that was really lovely.
I have one perhaps wrapping up question. I'm keeping an eye on the comments coming in. So people who are watching from afar, please share questions if you have them. But I'm curious, so you've done Charlotte Brontë. Do you have any plans to portray her sisters? Have you considered Frances Burney? Because if you want a large letter repository, she left it. Who's next on the list? I know you've done American historical women as well, but what are your aspirations?
Well, I love the idea of Frances Burney. I hadn't actually considered that, but it would be a lot of, she's remarkable.
I will talk about the mastectomy. That alone would be, yeah.
Between that and Patrick Bronte's cataract surgery, those two things in that time period, whenever I get squeamish about anything at the doctor's, I think, at least I'm not Fanny Burney. And it's a remarkable story. I've not thought about portraying Emily or Anne, I think partially because I feel so close to Charlotte. And I admire their work enormously as well. I don't know that I spent as much time inside their letters and diaries, though, partly because when they were children, Emily and Anne were so close. And they had this fantasy land they wrote about called Gondel. And then Charlotte and Branwell were so close, and they had their fantasy world of Angria. And I feel like I've sort of allied with Team Charlotte Branwell. So as much as I love Emily and Anne, I don't know that I could step into their shoes. One person I've been getting questions about a lot recently who intrigues me is Mary Shelley. So she might be coming up on the list at some point. That's another fabulous truth is stranger than fiction story. And would, of course, bring in Mary Wollstonecraft and lots of other fabulous people of the period to talk about, which is always exciting.
And we have a question. What other historical characters have you portrayed apart from Jane and Charlotte? So people who have not yet visited your website and seen the list, who else have you done?
So I guess going chronologically, I have Abigail Adams, largely because I live in Boston. And yes, and then Dolly Madison as well, who's another, fabulous Regency era woman, federal era in the States. Also, Louisa Catherine Adams, who I mentioned earlier, was the wife of John Quincy Adams. And up until Melania Trump, was the only non-American born First Lady. She was born in London and spent a lot of her life traveling in Europe with John Quincy as a diplomat. So very fun stories about the Napoleonic Wars with Louisa. And then I have Mariah Weston Chapman as well, who was a Boston-based abolitionist. She was the head of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. So she's the other one I have who's sort of mid-19th century, around the same era as Charlotte.
Excellent. If there aren't other questions, then perhaps we could move to the writing competition. Yes. So thank you so much, Laura. I really enjoyed hearing more about the background on how you put these immersive experiences together. Nadea is going to share the link to Laura's website so that people can stay up to date on when you get around to Frances Burney and other coming attractions. But before we wrap up, as part of tonight's event, we also wanted to share the winners of our recent letter writing contest and hear the winning entries read by Laura, so they'll get a proper dramatic reading. The first winner from the ages 18 and under category is Orla Nev Ray. So let's hear the first letter by Orla Nev.
Dear Alexander Worsley, as I pen this missive, inked quills scratching against the blank parchment, all I can envision is your smug expression once this letter reaches you. You have utterly consumed my being, plaguing me morn and night. The safety of my mind no longer remains, breached by your constant, overbearing presence. You must take pleasure in hearing of such an occurrence, having always enjoyed my suffering. I loathe you, or rather I loathed you. You are already well aware of the noticeable animosity that resides in my heart at the mere mention of your name, the way my eyes narrow, the way my hands flex and clench, and the way my teeth grind. You are entirely abhorrent, easily exemplified by your incessant teasing and infuriating behavior. And yet, my heart beats for you. Why is it that I am spellbound, mesmerized by something as simple as a glance in your direction? Your eyes are like limpid pools of poisonous green, so hauntingly alluring, filled with deadly venom that any sane individual would steer clear of. However, it is evident to me that I have lost the last grasp of my sanity, for I wish to drown in such a beautiful toxin. The strands of your flaxen hair shine like golden grains of sand blown about by the wind, reminding me of the exasperating sensation of sandy gravel clinging to my body after a day at the seaside. And your melodic voice, oh, how it taunts me, resembling a siren's allurement. Your words are like a gentle caress upon my ears, making me desire to drown out the beckoning sound, desperate to reclaim the dignity you have unknowingly purloined. Yet I cannot. I will admit, in the beginning, I could not bear to reside in close proximity to you, for it only made me wish to retch and roll my eyes. Yet now, I purposely seek your presence, like a pathetic puppy following around their owner or a small child in need of their mother. I crave your companionship. You and I are like the sun and moon, two sides of a coin, utterly different yet dependent on each other. As the light in my life, your rays of pure warmth seem to shine through the bleak, lonely, and dark existence I thought I was destined to endure. In spite of my growing, obsessive dependency, you remain blissfully unaware, insultingly so, as if you do not also indulge in such same desires. Do you not, sir? Are all your playfully teasing and flirtatious gestures an attempt to claim my heart before crushing it? Has that been your brilliant scheme all along? Seduce me and proclaim your success as the great player you are rumoured to be. Well, fortunately for you, I have succumbed to your beguiling ways. I've done everything I can to deny it, run from it, and destroy the growing feelings that threaten to bubble up and overflow after every small interaction. But there is no avoiding it any longer. Shackled, I am imprisoned by my own heart, and I will no longer allow you to have control over me. Mr. Alexander, I am irrevocably, helplessly, and completely in love with you. My soul, calling and singing out to you like a heavenly choir, may as well bear your name, for my heart belongs to you. I am yours, and my only desire is for you to be mine. I am in no way, shape, or form in want of your pity, nor to be mocked. In the event that you read this letter and you find it to be fatuous and pitiful, then I hope the pouring out of my heart be humorous and entertaining to you. For if you truly guffaw, then I am nothing more than a royal jester, a court laughing-stock for having fallen in love with a cold-hearted man. Yet in the hypothetical scenario, in which my feelings of passion and admiration are not only received, but are also reciprocated, then please, I beg of you, write to me as soon as humanly possible. In complete surprise to me, this has been shockingly cathartic, humiliating yet rewardingly relieving. I cannot help but smile as I gaze at this vulnerable letter, feeling alleviated and mollified after releasing myself from the clutches of painful, bottled-up emotions. In usual fashion, send my greetings to your mother and father, and inform your darling sister that I procured the most invigorating novel that I wish to lend to her the next time she visits. Whether your words are sharp and piercing like daggers that leave scars on the soul, or soft and tender like a gentle hug that leaves lasting warmth and comfort, I await your response with the utmost respect and anticipation. Yours truly, Lucy Ainsley.
That was marvelous. Well done, Orla Nevre from Grand Island, New York, winner of the under 18 category. And now we have another letter that is submitted by Christina Moreland. I keep having to look at that and remind myself that it's not Catherine Moreland, but Christina Moreland, who is writing from Massachusetts.
Hunsford, near Westerham, Kent, April the 12th. Dear Sir, as it has been my great fortune to enjoy the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and it has always been that exalted lady's sincerest wish to uphold the respectability of her noble family, I cannot but be concerned, nay, grievously offended, by the portrayal of my patroness's esteemed nephew, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, in what I believe is called, to use the vulgar parlance of this century, your movie. In my role as a clergyman, I felt it advisable to abstain from watching this unseemly performance, but I have been informed by my dear Mrs. Collins, who deemed it necessary to acquaint herself with the details of this matter, but only for the sake of that great lady who has so often paid us the compliment of her condescension, that you chose to depict Mr. Darcy emerging from a pond wearing naught but a wet shirt and breeches, to display that gentleman in whose veins flows the blood of two ancient honourable lines in such a manner as not only injurious to Mr. Darcy, though it pains me to admit his reputation is no longer what it was, since he has lately entered into so unequal a match, but this is the more significant point. You have demeaned one whom could never be regarded with too little deference. I refer, of course, to Lady Catherine, who has suffered a blow that might have destroyed the happiness of a less amiable and sensible woman. As proof of her eminent character, however, she bears this affliction with grace and not with concern for her own pride, but for the sake of the many young ladies in the world whose virtue is now under attack. Mr. Collins, said she only a se'nnight ago, we must not forget what Mr. Fordyce instructs in his sermons to young ladies, that they bear the responsibility of promoting virtue and righteousness. How are such tractable creatures to behave if they are taught to admire licentious displays of the male form? Miss de Bourgh then gave a delicate cough. leading her admirable mother to declare that had her daughter's health allowed her to marry, she would have ensured the continued respectability of Mr. Darcy's personage. Let me advise you then, dear sir, to cast off this unworthy theatrical production, though if you must keep it in circulation, I flatter myself that the scenes in which I appear may counteract that unfortunate tendency in young ladies to think too highly of men to whom they are not married. In the words of my dear patroness, I take no leave of you, sir. I am seriously displeased. William Collins. Address on envelope, Andrew Davies, Kenilworth, Warwickshire.
Bravo, Christina. You deserve the last name Moreland. You clearly stepped right out of an Austen novel. That was wonderful.
It was amazing reading too, Laura. That was just fantastic. So thank you so much for gracing us with your presence tonight, and also our winners of our letter writing contest with your dramatic reading. That was awesome.
Well, thank you for having me, and to them for such wonderful material.
They're amazing.
Each of those winners will receive a 50% scholarship to attend the 2025 in-person Jane Austen summer program, as well as a gift set of books. So thank you to our winners, and congratulations to the winners, and thank you all for those who entered the contest. I assure you our judges had a lot of fun reading your entries.
I can imagine. We hope that all of you will join us for our final event in our spring series, which will be a moderated discussion with Lizzie Dunford and Ann Dinsdale, the principal curators at Jane Austen's House Museum and the Brontë Parsonage, respectively. So Laura's final clips really get us in the mood for this upcoming program. Because both our speakers are in England, we're going to be meeting at a different time than usual. We're going to meet at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, May 15th, and we hope that most of you will be able to join us live. Of course, if you're unable to attend in real time, the recording will be available on our website afterwards. This discussion with two people so intimately involved with Jane Austen and the Brontes will be a wonderful way to round out this series.
So we do hope that you will all take a moment to register for that event so you can make sure to get it in your calendar and not miss it on the 15th. And when you do, please consider making a donation to support the Jane Austen Summer Program. This is not the only program that we make available. Many of you have had the opportunity to come to the Jane Austen Summer Program and may have heard about the new project that is in the beta stages, Jane Austen's Desk, which will be a fantastic online repository of information about Jane Austen and the composition of her novels, which sets them in a richly developed historical context. So all of these resources are made available for teachers and scholars and people who just love Austen. And your support makes it possible for us to make this free for people who can't afford to support it. So please consider helping us keep this available for everybody. It really makes a big difference.
And before we wrap up tonight, first, I just want to say thank you to Heather for your first time co-hosting. We hope that you will come back and join us again. And thank you again one more time to Laura for this fabulous talk. Just a reminder to everyone that the recording of tonight's presentation will be posted to our website, www.janeaustenandco.org, and to our YouTube channel very soon. And if you can't wait until our next event on May 15th, you can view any of our previous programs on the website as well. There are over 40 lectures ranging in topics from astrology in the Age of Austen, Jane Austen in magazines, and our entire last series, The Many Flavors of Jane Austen, about modern adaptations. So we hope that you enjoy these programs and that we will see you back here on May 15th. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.